let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Matt Travers. He'll be giving a candidate talk for a system scientist position in the Robotics Institute. He comes to us via Northwestern University, where he got his PhD working with Todd Murphy and
Lucy Powell.
His PhD work focused more on novel estimation techniques for systems that are flying around. And then he decided to come here to Carnegie Mellon and throw it all away to become a mobility expert. And he's been dedicating his last few years putting together a research program focused on robotics mobility. In doing so, he sometimes looks at biology for some inspiration, but he does it in a way that's more principled than I think others may have done in the past. I really encourage him, through his talk, ask as many questions as possible. Matt very much enjoys interacting with interested minds. He really does advise the students in the biorobotics lab quite a bit. So without further ado, I will give you Matt.
Thank you very much, Howie. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank all of you for coming, taking the time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to this presentation. Also the department, the committee, I'd definitely like to thank you for the opportunity to come and talk today. So I always like to start talks off by showing a video to provide some sort of perspective. And I don't want you to think here I'm showing you this video of this snake flopping around and I'm really trying to set the bar low for the rest of this talk. What's going on, this really was the state of the art in force control for snake-like robots in about 2014. So this is not long ago. The point here, right, is that this problem that you're looking at, this is just a difficult problem. It is a high degree of freedom system. It is an environment which is next to impossible to map in a reasonable way. So this is it's a really difficult type of problem to solve. So not necessarily just for snakes, but in general, trying to get mobile systems through very, very complicated terrains is really the problem that I've been focusing on for a number of years and I'm very interested in moving forward. Now, to keep things honest, here's some perspective the opposite direction, right? This is a biological snake moving through most likely a more difficult type of terrain than I showed in that previous video. And it's amazing, right? The snake moves through the reeds, it goes up and over, it's climbing over three-dimensional clutter. It's really amazing here. And the thing is that, we've spent a lot of time looking at videos just like this and trying to figure out, why can I not get a snake robot to basically do this? And we came to a conclusion that's going to sort of be a theme throughout the talk, which is that you don't really just need to be doing force control. You don't just need to be compliant. You also need to have some structure. You need to have some kinematics that enable you to interact with the environment and able to push off of it when you have these highly articulated systems. But you still need to be compliant so that you don't actually get stuck. And the joke here, obviously, or perhaps not obviously, but down at the bottom of this slide is, snakes evolved from lizards about 150 million years ago. So in terms of biological motion control, this is the state of the art about 150 million years ago. So there's a little bit of room to wiggle here in this particular space of motion controllers. So anyway, the title of the talk is Shape-Based Compliance for Locomotion. And in talking to several people, I realized that they may not know what that means. So I'm going to structure the talk around several questions which will hopefully answer that for you. The first is going to be, what is shape? What do I mean by shape? The second is going to be, where do shapes come from? The third is going to be, how can I design compliance around a shape? And I'll get, explicitly into exactly what that means as I go. Excuse me, and then the fourth is going to be what's next. What are the future directions? Where is this work actually heading? So I'm going to start here in the technical section with a little bit of a plug for basic mobility science. And I think that sometimes people see a 30-degree of freedom, humanoid robot moving around, running a sequential quadratic program in real time and moving over cinder blocks, and they get sort of lost into why it's hard for them to understand why this guy over here is studying a 3-link swimmer in a viscous fluid. If I can control this other robot, what's the point in studying these low-dimensional systems? Well, part of the point, in basic, mobility science is really, it's trying to find some sort of, simplicity and tractability and simplicity, right? Can I go and boil down a very complicated problem to a sort of fundamental understanding of what it takes to make something move just in general? So for example, This is a 3-link kinematic snake. It's submerged in a viscous fluid. So it has 3 links, it has 2 actuated degrees of freedom. And the point that I'd like to make here, right, is if I want to try to get this guy to move, I could, excite its internal joints with some, sinusoidal-looking inputs. So this is a velocity-controlled system. Now, if I take the same system, and I take the exact same input to the system, so same velocity controller, but I now just start the system in sort of very small, just perturbations of the initial conditions for the system, all of a sudden, right, the system is flopping around. It's basically my snake in the grass again. So the point here, right, is that even in this extremely simple, literally simplest system that can swim, this notion of coordination, how I move a system's internal degrees of freedom simultaneously really ends up mattering. Of course, right, this problem only gets sort of compounded as you go to much more complicated systems. So for example, in this 18 degree of freedom hexapod over here, a 30 degree of freedom snake that you see simulated here at the bottom of the slide, or in the case of a biological snake that has hundreds of internal degrees of freedom that need to be coordinated simultaneously. So I'll move on, I promise, very shortly to more complicated systems moving in the real world, but just to drive home and sort of introduce the notion of what it is I mean by shape, I'm going to stick to my 3-link snakes for at least one more slide here. So I'll start introducing shape by sort of taking recourse to what I mean by a configuration space. And for the type of locomoting systems that I'm primarily interested in, from the simple to the more complex, their configuration spaces have this nice structure that allows them to be separated into 2 components, a position space and a shape space. The position space you can think of as corresponding to the position and orientation of a frame attached to a system center of mass, for example, and the base space is going to represent this space of internally controlled joint variables for the system. So in this vector field that I have drawn here on the right-hand portion of the slide, my base space is going to be represented by my θ1 and my θ2. The vector field is representing what infinitesimal motions in this base space are, the effect of infinitesimal motions in this base space that they have on corresponding motions in the position space. So more specifically, if I draw some path through my shape space, in this case I have a closed path, so this represents a gate in my internal variables. I'm starting and ending at the same location. I can do this temporally in time, so I can just repeat this motion. Anyway, so I can take this gate and I can now compute the tangent vector along each point of this gate, and I can compare that tangent vector to the underlying vector field that you see here. And by comparing them, I can take a dot product to basically see how well aligned these 2 vectors are. The more aligned they are, the more that infinitesimal motion is going to contribute to my overall net locomotion. So you can imagine for this particular gate that I have drawn right here, you can see that the tangent vectors, would be sort of almost principally aligned with this underlying vector field. So you can imagine that I get some sort of good, efficient kind of locomotion, right? So I can transfer my system all the way down the page, and it does so quite efficiently. If I have just a small change in the initial configuration of the system, I've now shifted this gate over in my shape space. Now the vectors are not so principally aligned. You can see I sort of move a little bit forward, but kind of curve down to the left over here, or to the right. And then just hammer this point home. The more misaligned my tangent vectors are to this underlying vector field, the worse my motion. In this case, my swimmer actually looks like it's swimming backwards, up and to the right. So the interesting thing, and what will be sort of relevant here for the rest of the talk, is that it's not like there's just a single path that I can draw through this vector field that's going to produce some sort of good locomotion, good being defined to be something that's going to take me from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. There's an entire family of gates that all sort of live in this particular region of the shape space. They might not produce the exact same motion, but they're sort of scaled versions of each other. So there's this notion that there's a region of the shape space that produces good locomotion patterns, in this case, good gates. So you could imagine, trying to go and parameterize this region, right? I want to define some sort of structure that enables me to go and with a very low dimensional parameterization, scale up or scale down my motion, and I want to build that structure directly into one of these functions. So why would this be good, right? So you can immediately think, right, for motion planning, if you now have, instead of just having motion primitives, so discrete things that I can concatenate together to form motion plans, imagine if now I can give you a low dimensional way to represent an entire family of different motions that produce similar but not exactly the same motion. So this idea, and the reason I bring it up, is because this is going to form sort of the basis of the way that I think about designing compliant controllers for complicated systems here in a couple slides. But I wanted to make that point early on. But it's this particular structure that you can actually go and exploit, not just for motion planning, but that you can actually exploit for designing compliant controllers for very complex systems. So now, as promised, moving on to more complicated systems, right? So going from my 3-link snake now to an actual snake robot, or to a hexapod robot, like you see drawn here on the left-hand portion of the slide. So, we've learned all of this stuff from going and investigating these fundamental low-dimensional systems. I don't want to just lose everything that I've learned about locomotion from studying these systems. I want to be able to apply as, sort of one-to-one as I can to more complicated systems. So what do? Prime idea would be to do some sort of dimensionality reduction. Can I take an n-dimensional space, so a very complicated robot, 18-dimensional, 16-dimensional shape space, and can I project down into a subspace, a low-dimensional subspace of this high-dimensional space? If I can do that realistically or reasonably using some sort of basis functions, represented by beta in this particular case, well, then I can use similar parameters, almost the exactly same parameters or the same concept of parameters, to now define in these subspaces good locomotion patterns, parameterized good locomotion patterns. So what does this actually look like in a real example? So in this space, the basis functions for this walking robot are going to correspond to stances at different portions of my gait cycle. So for a low amplitude path or gait through this particular parameterized space, which is a subspace of my overall shape space, I get these sort of small steps. If I increase the amplitude of my motion, I remain in the same subspace, right? I'm still in this alternating tripod, but now I've used a single parameter to scale up effectively my stride length. The same exact idea can be applied to snake-like robots. In this case, the equation that I have here listed at the bottom of the slide is a pretty famous equation in the snake robot literature. This is called the Serpenoid equation. It was originally sort of discovered or created by Professor Hirose in Japan. So I'm referring here to it as Hirose's Serpenoid. So with a simple trig identity, I can go and actually rewrite Hirose's Serpenoid equation in terms of a shape function, in the exact same way that I've defined a shape function previously for the walking robot. So in this case, these shape basis functions are no longer stances in a walking gait. The basis functions are themselves actually sort of these sinusoidal-looking fixed serpenoid bases. So, the question might be here, where do shapes come from in general? Right, you've given 2 examples, could be relatively simple examples, but if I don't want to just be a serpenoid or a alternating tripod for the rest of my life, where can I go to actually discover shapes in general? So, a number of years ago, we were actually in Egypt. We were actually doing some archaeological work underneath the pyramids in Giza. And we had gone across the entire world and we were very excited to go and put the robots in this cave and go do some exploration. And we made it about 5 feet before we realized that we couldn't move very much further because there was a slope, a 15-degree slope. And it turns out that locomoting with this particular robot on sand, on a granular surface, when it's flat, is not that much of a problem. But when you introduce a slope, it becomes very difficult to move. So we had, a number of years ago, been working with Dan Goldman, who's a professor at Georgia Tech. And Dan is a physics of living system professor. He's actually in the physics department. So he's not a biologist, but he's very interested in studying the physics of granular material. So Dan had been looking at a particular system and how it moves on sand. So this is a biological snake. This is a desert-dwelling snake. It's a side-winding snake in general. So again, this snake is it's amazing. It's not even just going up slopes, it's maneuvering on the slopes. So another thing too is that snakes are principally dissipative, right? So that means that looking at their kinematics tells you almost everything that you need to know about how they move, at least, in terms of how they change their curvature to produce net locomotion. So using this fact, we sort of took recourse to the literature, and there's an entire sort of branch learning effectively, which is called basis factorization. So in basis factorization, the nice part about this is that it does sort of a multi-dimensional SVD. So it'll actually, for us, having multiple dimensions, time and space, these types of learning techniques will actually go and learn the basis functions. So what you're doing is you're projecting a lot of biological data onto a set of spatial basis functions as well as some temporal parameters. The problem with this, and this is a result that Chao-Wei Gong had some beautiful insight on, is that when you're doing SVD in multiple dimensions, your choice of basis function in one dimension will actually affect your choice of basis function in the other dimension. So it tends out to be an NP-hard problem. So Chao-Wei had this beautiful sort of insight, which is that if you use domain knowledge, you can actually you can bound the complexity of this problem, this projection problem, and you can actually come up with very low dimensional, very nice ways of representing high dimensional data. The other nice part being is that you can actually do this in sort of closed form solutions. So this ends up giving us a very nice way to go to biology and now be able to come up with the shape functions that we sort of defined for the hexapods, we defined for the snakes using the serpenoid, but now we have a much more general method to give us sort of the basis for motion planning and, as I'll show, some sort of control here. So moving from planning to control, right? We now have ways of coming up with these parameterized motion primitives. So you can imagine we can start to build up libraries for doing motion planning, for doing things like, perhaps trying to follow a path. So this is from a garden over here on campus. So there's this winding path. So the real question was, what's the good way to go from these libraries of motions for different robots down to actually controlling robots? Sort of the first order approximation would be, can I use these low dimensional parameterizations to go and generate desired joint angles that end up being references for low level, like PID loops, so getting sent directly to the mechanism, or different mechanisms. So, what happens when you put the robots in confined spaces? So perhaps not surprisingly, the robots almost like 90% of the time just immediately get stuck. Right, so I've designed basically a motion for this system in free space, and I put it in a confined space, and not surprisingly, most of the time you spent stuck. Sometimes it'll fortuitously sort of figure its path or figure out a path, but that does not happen very often. So we again went back and started to ask ourselves, what's the problem here? So it turns out that this is almost like the exact complement to what I was showing in that very first video. Where in the very first video, I was doing almost a purely force-controlled strategy. Here I'm doing basically a purely position-controlled strategy. So in one, there was not enough structure. In this one, there is literally way too much structure. So how do I get around this problem? How do I find some sort of happy medium between these two? How can I be both compliant as well as rigid simultaneously? So for us, the answer was we needed to add another layer in our sort of control paradigm. We wanted to be able to dynamically start to warp our shapes in response to the external environment. So you can think of in that previous, sort of slides at the very beginning, imagine I have this whole family of good locomotion patterns. Can I actually use some sort of feedback from the environment to actually take and warp and bend that particularly good locomotion pattern to fit a particular set of environmental circumstances? So it turns out, right, this idea, we thought it was great at the beginning, and we had come up with this big sort of framework for thinking about how to do control. It turns out that people have been doing this for quite some time. And in particular, the CPG community does something very similar to this, although how the feedback actually enters in is a point for discussion if anyone would like to know more about that. So anyway, this is work that Ake Ishpiert has been doing for a number of years. He's done some great work in just basically getting lots of different systems, walking systems, slithering systems, swimming systems, a transition between the two. And he's done some amazing work in getting these systems to work and to do things like gate transitions, very smooth gate transitions. So Ake wrote a paper with Stefan Schall in 2012, where they sort of drew a relationship between sort of a more broad concept called dynamic movement primitives and CPGs, where a CPG effectively acts like a rhythmic dynamic movement primitive. So dynamic movement primitives are sort of this beautiful idea, and Stefan has been working on them for a very long time. I think the sort of big paper that he wrote, original paper, was goes back to 2002, but I think he's been working on it for time before that. Excuse me. So the idea behind a DMP is that you can take some sort of nominal behavior And you can actually take that behavior in real time by changing this function f here on the right-hand side of the equation at the top. You can take that nominal behavior and you can mold it and you can stretch it and you can form it to a new set of environmental circumstances that weren't there when you were originally doing the planning of this nominal task. And it works ridiculously well and it works in real time. So in this particular video, the cups can be moved. So you're changing sort of the parameters inside the environment, but the behavior is automatically adapting to them. So the nice part about the DMPs for us in thinking about how to control the types of robots we're really interested in is you can actually consider an admittance controller here written down in the closed loop form. An admittance controller or an impedance controller are actually special cases of a DMP. Right, they have the exact same dynamic form. The main difference is they're a special case because my forcing function in terms for an admittance controller is now specifically defined in terms of a measured joint torque. Right, so exact same form. So we went and we started to try to implement this on the robots, and we ended up with results very similar to what I was showing again in that very first video. It was this decentralized version, so we implemented this in the joint space. So we didn't have sort of correlation between joints. They weren't sharing information. You end up with this very decentralized, and it turns out to work decently well, but there isn't enough structure for the system to continue moving while being compliant. So how did we get around this? We go back to our shape functions, right? The whole idea here, to remind you, is that we project ourselves onto some low-dimensional version of our overall shape space. So we're giving up some sort of articulation in this projection, but we're building some sort of structure directly into how we actually specify these functions. And then we're building further structure into how to move well in these reduced dimensional spaces in terms of our alpha parameters. So we can actually utilize that, right? I mean, we now have effectively a change of coordinates. It's not a change of coordinates from like the workspace to the joint space, but it's effectively equivalent, right? It's an analytical function that tells me the relationship between these two spaces. I can actually use this change of coordinates to project my compliant controllers from this high-dimensional joint space down into this low-dimensional shape parameter space. So I can go and now define, literally, compliant controllers in this subspace of my overall joint space, but I'm building in the structure both of the subspace itself as well as good locomotion patterns within this particular subspace. So just to sort of be crystal clear on what's happening here, I'm adding a middle layer of control, where this middle layer of control is functioning like an admittance controller defined directly in terms of some shape parameters that are regulating around some nominal parameterization alpha sub 0. Those are now getting transferred back down to my lower loop control. My robot is actually regulating around some desired joint angles, which are changing at every time step as I'm moving through the environment. So what does this actually look like? So this is now doing admittance control directly on the amplitude parameter in this particular basis function. The basis function is a thing that is specifying that there's a wave and a half on the snake's body in this case. So this is doing an admittance control on a single parameter, the amplitude of this wave. So you can make a similar idea work for now basically the height of the chassis in this walking robot. So it has an alternating tripod gate basically going on, but the phase of that gate is always set to be 0. So both, it's in stance. So as I start to pull and push on the robot, and truth in advertising, this is a function of sort of the resolution of at one point I pick the body up and it doesn't go back down under the force of gravity, but that's because it can't sense it, not because the controller doesn't work. So anyway, this is basically adjusting the height of all the legs simultaneously. So same idea, different robot.
Good question.
Yeah, sure.
Were you moving it side to side also?
Yeah, so it's doing, yes. So basically what that's demonstrating is the actual mechanical compliance in the system.
That part did not come from the controller.
That's exactly correct. So although if you started to pick it up like that with just the mechanical compliance, the legs would come with you. And if you started to push past a certain point down, it would start to fight you like dramatically. The title of the talk, right, is not shape-based compliance of a robot sitting on the ground, it's shape-based compliance and locomotion. So what happens when we turn on the phase of our gate? So in this particular example, you can actually see the robot. It starts out with a very large amplitude in this particular waveform. As it starts to contact that first peg, the forces of the robot interacting with the pegs actually start to squeeze the amplitude until the robot actually sort of resonantly, its shape starts to resonate with the peg spacings. So this is just a function of running a single amplitude admittance controller, and you sort of get this nice resonance, and it'll sort of swim through these pegs very sort of efficiently. Similar idea now working with the walking robot. So in this case, the stable behavior is basically set to be around a 0 amplitude walking gait. So as I start to pull on the robot, I'm basically increasing the stride length of the robot. The nice part about this is at the next time step, or the next one here, when I actually push back on the robot, it'll actually start to walk backwards. So it is a compliant behavior designed around 0. So when I pull, it'll walk forward. When I push, it'll walk backwards. And again, this happens, it's doing effectively regulation on a single parameter. I'm controlling these 18 joints. So, a lot of people have asked, right? I mean, it's great. You can go and adjust amplitude over an entire, effectively globally control amplitude of a particular shape. What happens? You were stating that you're ultimately interested in working in systems in cluttered, complex environments. So if you go and you really do go back and look at the biological systems, biological snakes, you see that they don't ever really sort of do this kind of global amplitude, whatever, adjustment. They're actually doing something that's very much more local. They're always sort of locally, especially around the head, forming their shape to the pegs and then passing that shape back. So this led me to start thinking about what would be the best way to sort of represent these type of kinematics effectively. So we actually thought, right, this is basically just doing amplitude modulation. So it looks like there is, you're not getting constructive and destructive interference of these waves. It looks like a shape forms and gets pushed back. So it led us to think, right, there must be some sort of fundamental underlying frequency with which these waves are getting pushed back. So let's call that a carrier wave that has some particular frequency. Then let's think about having different amplitudes at different points of the body by coming up with a modulation signal for this carrier waveform. And then let's go and actually put that on the robot and see what types of shapes that we can get. So indeed, by allowing the modulation signal in the waveform to have the same frequency, you can get these exact type of kinematics that, well, not exact, but similar kinematics to what you see in the biological systems, at least with respect to being able to push shapes back down the body. So I won't bore you with too many of the details here. The way that we actually went and implemented this was using Gaussian-based activation windows. Each activation window has its own amplitude. By setting that amplitude independently in the different windows, you can start to get kinematics that look like this. So what happens when you go and now use this new definition of a shape function to go and derive compliant controllers? So as you might imagine, this gives me the ability, to independently modulate the amplitude, compliantly modulate the amplitude in different portions of the body. You don't lose anything that you had in this sort of global controller, right? You can do the exact same types of compliance, but what you get is a higher degree of articulation. So, this started to work. This is, it started to get exciting around now because we could no longer sort of even get the snakes stuck. So what we were doing with the position controllers, we no longer really had those problems. And like you can see, like its body will start to literally just wrap around the pegs based on the external forces. And this works really, really well. And we've done several different variations of this subsequently, but these were exciting times. So I won't go into any of the sort of mathematical details in this talk. If you want to talk about them, I'm more than happy to. But instead of just scaling up and scaling down these amplitudes within a particular basis space, you can actually do things like start to rotate basis functions. So here you can sort of see the leg shakes here, which is the end result of using SEAs. But the cool part here is that I'm now defining a different way to specify the shape function. And what this allows me to do is actually rotate the basis function themselves. So if you're the more astute control-y people in the crowd might notice that I'm actually doing positive feedback here. So when I start to apply a force on one part of the body, it'll actually start to push back on me, which allows me to sort of level out the body. You might be asking yourselves, why don't you just do this with an IMU? We have IMUs. That's a good question. It was more, IMUs they have their own problems, especially if you're walking around in super complex terrain and you're bouncing around a lot. So we wanted to sort of see how far we could get just based on basically trying to equalize forces out in different portions of the snake's body. Excuse me, the hexapod's body. The other cool part about this is that it's effectively just as easy to control the peg, compliance, so the planar compliance, as it is to control things in 3D. So here, what ends up happening is you effectively have a torsional compliant mode, and I'm not going to, include any of the math that makes this work. I'd be happy to talk about it. It's in an RSS paper that I'll be presenting in a couple weeks. But again, this is just a little bit more complicated way of actually specifying a shape function. The nice part is how you go and derive the shape-based compliant controllers is exactly the same. You just start taking, effectively, you use the fact that you have a change of coordinates. You can project torques from your joint space into your shape parameter space. So here's a very similar idea of the hexapod, now sort of regulating its orientation as it's moving through a pile of rocks. The thing to be said also, I didn't mention it, so the robots are all blind in all of these experiments. They don't have any map of the environment. It's all just basically a regulating, closed loop controller. So it's just doing feedback control, and you start to get pretty robust behaviors with respect to being able to move around very complex terrains. So, starting to sort of wrap up what we have been working on. We asked ourselves very recently, and we just submitted a paper on this, can we sort of take this a little bit further? What else can we do with thinking about compliantly controlling these articulated mechanisms? So here we started to ask ourselves, can I actually start to use compliance or use proprioception to start controlling things like behaviors. So what you're seeing here, the dynamics at the top of the page are just the amplitude dynamics. It's an amplitude and a phase, so this is basically polar coordinates. These particular dynamics for the amplitude will experience a Hopf bifurcation when I change the value or change the sign of the mu parameter. So when mu is a positive value, the system will be in a stable limit cycle. When mu goes to a negative value, the system will experience a stable node. What this means, experimentally, is that when I actually have the system walk into the wall, it will go from having a stable limit cycle, so stable walking, to a stable stance. So a node in this particular space represents a stable stance. If you look at the vector field, you can actually see when this happens. So the properties of the vector field, literally I'm changing the stability properties in the behavior space, if you want to think about it that way, using just proprioception to actually cause the trigger. So then you can take this actually one step further. So this is, truthfully, realistically, just sort of acting like a finite state machine where there's two states. The nice part about what I'm about to tell you or show you is that this gives you a very, very nice way to interpolate between different behaviors. So your literally joint positions in one behavior and your joint positions in another behavior. So we took the idea in the last slide one step further, which is to say that we now have multiple different behaviors. And when both behaviors are always on, just one behavior is always in a stable stance, while the other behavior is always in a stable limit cycle. So when the stability properties, when the value of mu changes signs, what ends up happening is the stable limit cycle goes to a stable node, and the stable node goes to a stable limit cycle. So you switch behaviors. So what you can use this to actually do, same behavior as before. I'm going to have my hexapod walk up, run into a wall, except now instead of stopping, I'm going to transition into a second behavior, which is a climbing behavior. So I go, I end up climbing, and what you can notice here from the blue and the red dot, right, is that both behaviors are always on. And then when I actually get up onto the top of the obstacle, I switch back into my walking gait. The other cool part about this, and I'm showing lots of different heights, is I actually sort of create a stack of these compliant behaviors. So there's multi-tiers. So there's actually effectively a DMP running around the climbing behavior. So the system is set to nominally climb 16 centimeter obstacles, but it's always adjusting the height based on sort of when the front leg first touches down. So if the front leg touches down and the height is higher, the system will actually push the body higher. So it's scaling its behavior basically based on proprioception given just literally the proprioception. Anyway, so, for future directions, where's all this stuff going? That's fine, hexapods are great, snakes are great. Where are you going with this? So we've done serial topology, we've done network topologies. Sort of a big direction here is going into continuous topologies. So how do we sort of differentiate the stuff that we have been doing? What's sort of the next cool big thing. Typical example systems, if you want to think about it that way, would be something like a flatworm that I'm showing here at the top of the slide, or the swimming stingray that I'm showing here at the bottom of the slide. So some of the cool questions that come up and you go from serial topologies or network topologies to continuous topologies are, how do you sort of apply these dimensionality reduction techniques that we've been using very successfully for the systems that we have been studying? How does that apply now to systems that have multiple spatial dimensions? So what are shape modes for these systems? How do the shape modes interact? A very interesting problem here is, we sort of ignore this in the snakes, but because the system can bend this way and bend this way, there's actually a torsioning, right? So there's an infinite number of copies of SO3 along this backbone. What we do with the snakes is sort of ignore this for the most part, but when you start to go to controlling surfaces, you have all of these copies of SO3 happening now in multiple dimensions, so you really have to start thinking about how to geometrically specify shapes for this particular system. So that's interesting. Some other stuff like information flow, representation, and estimation. If I really want to go build these things, if I really want to control them, I have to worry about these problems. How do I share information? So in my snakes, I had this sort of amplitude modulation. What does that look like now in 2D? Do I need to propagate information to the left, to the right, back, forward? How does this work? How do you estimate curvature unless you have sensors everywhere on your sheet? How do you do estimation in a reasonable way? And then something that I haven't really talked about at all throughout the talk, you might be wondering if you know about the SEAs, have you done anything cool with sort of passive dynamics, right? If I have these mechanical springs distributed throughout my system, can you do something cool with that? The answer is we have not previously. The answer is in the future, I would definitely like to. So this is a video of the MIT soft robot Stingray. So this guy is very, very underactuated. There's actually only 2 actuators that are controlling everything that you're seeing right here. I think that there's a third actuator that actually basically controls like a swim bladder. So it's doing the buoyancy to actually control Z here. The interesting part about this is it's 2 flippers, rigid flippers, and then what they've done in the papers on this all go into how to actually choose the material so that the frequency that you're actually flapping will be at the resonance of the material. So you get these actual waves propagating down the body. And I think that that's cool, and I think that having very, very compliant systems is very interesting, where there's this sort of passive mechanical properties that you're taking advantage of to efficiently sort of locomote at some resonant frequency. I think ultimately in moving forward that soft systems are great. We've gotten a lot of mileage out of typical robotic systems, but somewhere in between is a very interesting space, right? I mean, how rigid do you actually need to make your system? How can you make it semi-soft, semi-rigid, take advantage of things like passive mechanics in a really smart way? And I think that that's a very interesting direction. The same type of problem you can imagine might actually apply to, trying to do like coordinated transportation using multiple highly mobile systems, right? So each of these systems, like when I was showing the hexapod walking over the rocks, right? It's a very, very compliant behavior, right? That's how the system is so robust. What happens if you now rigidly attach a bunch of these very, very compliant systems to each other via some rigid object, where you now have this exact same problem of how to be compliant while at the same time satisfying some sort of rigid constraints. So, and then the last one here is this idea of using shape bases is, it's shown up in several different contexts. In locomotion, it's shown up under the name, and in manipulation, it's shown up under the name of kinematic synergies. So synergies get used for a lot of different things. There's muscle synergies, kinematic synergies. So in the manipulation literature, you can think of my shape bases are effectively equivalent to kinematic synergies in the manipulation literature. And it's the same sort of idea, except instead of having stable stances like I had for my walking system, they have actually stable grasps. So you can think of these as like eigengrasps. And I always like to include this particular graphic here, which is from a Marco Santello paper going back all the way to 1998. But 2 of their sort of eigengrasps are circular ashtray and beer mug. This is from a user study, and I figured, if you're going to be part of a user study, this is sort of like the one you want it to be a part of. And anyway, with that, I will stop here. This is doing the same controller that you were seeing in the rocks previously, but I think it was a pretty good representative video, and open it up for questions.
Given
user study, they just told them to imagine grasping a beam.
Yeah. Well, that makes it somehow much less interesting. Sanjeev.
Yeah, I wonder if you could contrast this whole approach to the mob-fold approach of that they take. I mean, obviously with the snake robots, with the full body being contact, that seems very compelling. For the spider walking through the rough terrain, I wonder, are these? You know, I can see that there are differences. I'm not sure that they're meaningful differences. Do you think of them on some sort of spectrum where you're solving a different problem, or you're solving the same problem in a better way, or?
So I'd be cautious to say that I'm solving solving the problem in a better way. So, you know, to relate this to some of the Rex work, right, where they're basically ambling over rocks and they're taking advantage, basically in that case, of, you know, dynamic stability properties of the mechanism. But it is very similar in the fact that, right, they're using compliance and the stability properties of the system are giving them, you know, a lot of robustness. So when you start to go over the very, very rough terrains, I'm not sure any of us really, I mean, with the analyzing your actual, you know, roll dynamics, for example, right? I mean, that gives you a good way to think about why that's, you know, that particular behavior is stable to, you know, I mean, it's passively stable, right? So I mean that you can understand the properties of that system based on the dynamic, whatever, your dynamic analysis. For us, it's a little bit different, right? We're actually actively always, we have a higher degree of articulation and we're not necessarily in a dynamic regime. So it's not like analyzing, it's not like doing dynamic analysis for us is even, it's not apparent that that's the right type of analysis, right? I mean, we're in this weird space in between sort of kinematic, I mean, and dynamic, because we have all of these dynamics happening because of the compliance in the legs, but we're also ultimately sort of trying to do dynamic stabilization or like orientation control of our body as we're moving. So the two I think are subtly different. I think that being able to move towards a more dynamic analysis where you do have better guarantees on the stability, I think is something that's super interesting. I do think that the problem that we're solving has other applications. So doing stability analysis is interesting, but if you think about, you know, sort of when I was showing the graphic of the hexapods carrying, you know, the triangle, but imagine, you know, it's an actual object. I think being able to actually have some sort of combination in between, and I don't have a good way of saying this, or the analysis to support it, but I think that there's a lot of room to sort of operate in a non-Rex regime that needs to be explored.
How about the work with like little dog or maybe those things are showing
When they're,
like this?
Yeah, that's right. So doing like explicit footstep planning. Again, you know, we're not doing that. We're not mapping the environment, and it's not an explicitly. Again, this is. I don't want this to seem like a cop-out answer, but it's not really that either, right? I mean, it's a very compliant. It's not doing little dog stuff. But I do think that honestly, being able to have actuators. It's not necessarily being in the middle or being sort of in the Rex regime or being in the little dog regime. I think what ultimately is really the interesting question here is having a platform that's capable of being, you know, a dynamic platform, being a platform that's capable of doing careful footstep planning or doing sort of the more like ambling over rocks behaviors that we're doing currently. I think the interesting question here is knowing when you need to do one or the other, right? When I really want to move fast, you know, being dynamic and taking advantage of the fact that I have some sort of dynamic stability properties is what you want to do. If I want to go and place, you know, get across and you do some type of mapping with some sort of reasonable body orientation, you know, I need to keep a sensor sort of stiff or, you know, at a fixed location or orientation, you know, I think that what we're doing now is sort of what you want to be doing. If I really need to go and like, you know, put a peg in a hole, you know, 50 feet away and get there very precisely, I think that doing something like the little dog approach is what you want to do. So I think that the more interesting question here is not doing one or the other, it's how to know when to transform between one or the other strategy. Steve.
Given the incredible computational power available to an organism like a snake,
Yep.
and well,
That can mean a lot of different things.
There are a lot of neurons in there, and increasingly available in robots. What is the advantage of a mathematically simple, elegant expression of your controller, as opposed to something maybe not intellectually accessible, but derived from a lot of experience?
We'll just use deep learning. So the answer is that's a great question, right? The answer goes back to the very beginning of the talk, right? I mean, you can think of these types of compliant controllers as being sort of like the 3-link snake version of doing locomotion control, right? I mean, this is a reasonable starting place, and I think that it's not even just necessarily computation for us that's really lacking, it's really sensing, right? I mean, snakes, have all these tactile sensors. They can sense the environment in a lot of ways that we just aren't able to with these particular robots, right? There's a lot more information, different types of information that they're processing that we don't currently have. And I think moving into the future, like I would love to be in that realm. I would love to put FSRs, have these gigantic arrays that allow me to feel every rock and every crane, I mean, it would completely change the way that I could think about doing the control, right? I can't sense I can't sense a magnitude and a normal vector in 3D right now, right? I might be able to start doing things like force balance and doing computational approaches to control in the plane, and people in fact do this, do exactly this, where they explicitly try to do force balance and try to reject forces that aren't helping their nominal locomotion in the direction they want to go. People do this, but the big problem is these methods as they stand are very scalable from the plane to 3D, from one system to the other. So I think as a reasonable starting place, this is a good place to be right now given our current capabilities, but going forward in the future, I would love to be there. Yeah, of course.
Quick follow-up that's sort of on the other end of the spectrum. I'm curious, you have this very principled approach right now. Have you gone head-to-head with a more hacky approach and had a student just tinker and see how well you can do on one of these obstacle courses?
Yes, is the answer. So we've tried all sorts of different things. In fact, that very first video where it was just thrashing around in the grass was originally designed to try to work in pegs. So that was a little bit hackier. We've tried doing things with sensing torque and then just sort of explicitly trying to encode a shape and doing like a fixed time lag to pass it down the body. So we've had kids work on this for summers and summers. And it turned out that, even doing a hacky approach, it turns out to get complicated very quickly. So they work with some sort of reasonable success, but none of them were like a smashing success that made us throw our hands up and say we've solved the peg locomotion problem. The other thing that I will bring up too is not in comparison to a hacky version, but it's hard to go and prove things about what you're seeing right here, right? Like I don't have a theorem proof paper on shape-based compliance at this point. I would love to, don't get me wrong. But what we have done is comparisons to other state-of-the-art methods. So like CPGs augmented to have torque feedback in the same ways that we're incorporating them. So we've tried to make it as apples to apples with the state-of-the-art. Implemented them on this robot, so these are part of our RSS results. And we do measurably better than the current state-of-the-art, even augmented to try to emulate the same exact type of controller that we're implementing here. Stellian.
How do you know when you have enough shape functions when you're trying to get some of these composite controllers and so on?
How do you know when you have enough?
Yeah.
So you don't is sort of the short answer. The interesting thing is that if you have one, so you do a global sort of approach, you do much better if you add, if you go to 3. If you go to 6, you do slightly better than you do with 3, and if you go all the way down to having one controller for every joint, you basically hit like a, not diminishing returns necessarily, but you don't see any more improvement after a particular point. So it comes down to a very interesting question of like granularity. How complicated do you need to make your controller, or how simple, honestly, to go back the other way, what's sort of the correct spot at which to sort of split up the degree to which you're decentralized. And again, I mean, it's experimental at this point, but I think it's a very interesting question.
And so going from the snake to the snake monster,
yep.
I'm not sure that the same exact observation would apply. Just because there's so much structure in the legged robot where, if the shape is essentially one of the gates, well, with 6 legs, you can have a lot of different types of gates.
That's correct. So what you're doing there is you're actually going to change the bases, right? So the way that I have it set up right now, the bases are fixed. You're in a space, and you're regulating in that space. We have done work, in fact, Julian and Francesco, wherever he is, have done work where you actually go and are compliant in the bases. So you can go, you give yourself a little bit more articulation, you can start switching that, but that work was for the snakes. Going forward, thinking how you can actually compliantly switch bases so that you could have you could be in a space almost in between a wave gate, for example, and walk in an alternating tripod. How to do that, I think is also, that's something that we're pursuing. One of the things that you can do, which is a better analogy probably, is you can go from a alternating tripod and you can start to imagine controlling individual legs individually. What we do right now is, it works pretty well, which is with the alternating tripods, especially with starting to do the orientation control. So you can get pretty far doing that. But yes, moving forward, in fact, we're writing a number of proposals right now that talk about exactly this, how to actually change the structure of the space that you're doing the control in. Anyone else? I don't know.
Those you're supposed to.
I think Howie would say let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.